Jesus replied, "Let the faith of God be in you. Listen to the truth I speak to you. If someone says to this mountain with great faith and having no doubt, 'Mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the midst of the sea,' and believes that what he says will happen, it will be done. This is the reason I urge you to boldly believe whatever you ask for in prayer. Believe that you've received it, and it will be yours."
Good morning. So thrilled to have everyone watching online this morning. I'm Pastor Doug, and over 4.5 billion of you have access to the internet this morning. That is so cool, but no pressure at all. So very few of us would have imagined just 3 short weeks ago that we would be where we are today. In a world that is more connected in every way than ever before, the potential for this to become a global problem was all in place. And it's also scary how in a world that is so interconnected, so dependent on one another, that the solution to fight this pandemic has been separation and isolation. We already had a societal crisis of loneliness and despair and isolation, and this has only made things worse. So that's why it's so important for you to reach out and call and talk to someone who's feeling lonely and isolated, who may not have any sort of support system. And that's why we started a community care network for helping us to look after others. But you can go even wider if safely possible. Offer assistance to your neighbors or organizations that are helping people. We recently took 3 large bins of bread downtown to a group that's providing sandwiches for our most vulnerable people living on the streets. And we continue to offer food and assistance here to people seeking help. Now, more than ever, even though we're no longer meeting in a church, it's important for us to be the church. The hands of Jesus helping the fearful and the hurting. Hey, I also want to briefly mention our upcoming online services. Next Sunday, we kick off the week leading up to Easter with Pastor OJ sharing on Palm Sunday, followed by Good Friday, where you don't want to miss Pastor Nathan, and finally Easter Sunday, 2 weeks from today. Join me as I share on Jesus and the Walking Dead. It'll be a lot of fun. But most importantly, it'll be a strong message of hope at a time when the world so desperately needs it. So, as you see the information on social media, please share it and invite friends and relatives and neighbors and coworkers to join us online. So this morning, we're continuing our series entitled Relevant Then and Now. And my title today is Breaking Religion's Rules. Back in 1991, an American rock group named REM released an album which sold over 12 million copies worldwide and won multiple awards. Their biggest hit was entitled Losing My Religion.
That was just a dream. That was just a dream. That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight, losing my religion, trying to keep up with you, and I don't know.
And you know what's ironic and funny about this song? Is that it wasn't written about a loss of faith, but it was written about a broken romantic crush. However, it did strike a major chord with many people, and it became an anthem for those who were tired of organized religion, those who had been hurt, those who had been disenfranchised. Because you see, by default, The gravitational pull of religion is towards conforming you to some type of behavior. Religion says you have to look the right way, you have to say the right things, and you definitely have to act the right way. And you can't hang around these type of people and those type of people. Well, definitely you can't associate with them. And should you question any of this? Well, questioning what you were taught, questioning what you grew up learning, questioning the rules was pretty much the unpardonable sin. And that is likely why millions left the church, left Christianity, or just stayed away from organized religion altogether. Either you couldn't keep the rules because there were far too many of them, or you didn't want to keep them, or most importantly, they just didn't make sense to you, and you were told you couldn't question them. And if we grew up in the church as children or teens, when we did have questions about the rules, we were told the answer was, because the Bible tells us so. Or, if the Bible says it, that settles it. And then our children grew up hearing the same things. And then they headed off to college or university or into real life. And it just didn't cut it anymore. No longer was it real and authentic to just conform, to just follow the rules unconditionally. Who knew that religion had set so many up for failure and guilt and shame? Who knew? Well, how does this relate to what was happening 2,000 years ago? So, just before we head into our time machine, and just before we see what was relevant then and how it's relevant now, before we do that, just a little bit of humor about the rules. So for every husband that's watching this morning, you know, yes, you do, that there are a set of rules your wife has for you. It's kind of like the Matrix. You may not see them. You may not acknowledge them, but they are there, watching you, haunting you. And if you ever figure out those rules, your wife changes them and doesn't tell you. And they don't apply to her, only to you. And if you ever dare ask about the rules, she'll deny they exist. But like they say on the X-Files, the truth is out there. So, where were we? Oh yes, we were going back in time. So 2,000 years ago, you may not know this, but there were over 600 religious rules that had been laid out for the Jewish people, including the Big Ten, the 10 Commandments. But the religious leaders had added hundreds of additional rules, many of which made no sense at all, and many of which were quite ridiculous. And all of the Jewish people were expected to follow them, and the religious leaders were all too willing to be the police of these. Many of these rules also helped ensure that they were able to keep control as well. However, Jesus came and threatened their control and threatened their established order. But just before we see how Jesus was the original religious rule rebel, let's go to the book of Acts, where we've been the last few weeks. So the book of Acts was written by Luke, who was a historian and a physician and a follower of Jesus. And it's a historical record of what happened after Jesus was crucified and then resurrected from the dead. It serves as a model and example of telling the good news, also called the gospel, to the entire world. And this good news message was clear. Jesus was the Son of God, and he came to earth. He was crucified and resurrected, and he did this because he loved and valued everyone. However, during this time, the rules of religion tried to get in the way, and they almost sidetracked everything. So Acts chapter 10 begins to turn the tables upside down on the rules of religion. It tells a story of a Roman military officer, a centurion named Cornelius. And we're told he was a good man. And an angel appears to him in a vision and says, God has heard your prayers and seen your gifts to the poor. He remembers you and all you have done. Wow! God had noticed him, and not only noticed him, but sent an angel to talk to him. That's pretty elite company. But how? How could he be good enough for God? As a non-Jew, he wasn't from the right group of people. He didn't follow or act or behave according to the hundreds of rules he was supposed to. But instead, the angel mentions just 2 things that he did that caught God's attention. He says, God has heard your prayers and has seen your gifts to the poor. He remembers you and all you have done. Just 2 things. He has a relationship with God. He prays. He talks with God. And number 2, he cares about others. So it's really quite simple. Love God, love others. Nothing about the 600 rules from the Old Testament and the hundreds more that the Jewish leaders had put in place. Why does this sound so familiar? Why only 2 rules? Because Jesus himself said, when he was asked about all the rules and all the commandments and which one was the most important, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and most important command. And the second command is like the first. Love your neighbor the same as you love yourself. All of the law and the writings of the prophets take their meaning from these 2 commands. So all of the commands, all the rules and regulations about how we should act or look or behave and on and on and on, all come down, can all be summed up in just 2 rules. Does that mean we can kill and steal and cheat and lie and commit adultery and gossip, etc.? No, because they would all violate either or both of these 2 simple rules, loving God and loving others. It's all about relationship with God and with others. Well, the vision continues, and the angel also tells Cornelius the centurion that he needs to talk to Peter, one of Jesus' disciples. He needs to invite him to his home. So he sends his servants to go fetch Peter. Little did he know, though, that Peter, a Jew, could never set foot in his house because of the religious rules. But fortunately, at the same time, in another part of the country, God gives Peter a crazy dream. It's this really strange dream about all these wild animals. And they were considered unclean according to the religious rules. But God tells him to go ahead and eat them. Well, Peter's kind of confused, and so he argues in the dream saying, but God, I've never eaten anything that's unclean. I've always followed the rules. God answers him and says that if I've made these things clean, they're okay to eat. And yet Peter wonders what the dream means. Shortly after that, the centurion's men arrive and knock on Peter's door and tell him to come back with them. So he accompanies them back to Cornelius' house. And when he arrives, Peter says, hey, you know it's against the religious rules for me to associate with you, right? And enter your house. But God showed me in a dream that Jesus has come to everyone, no matter who they are. And Peter began to speak. And he says in Acts 10, I really understand now that God does not consider some people to be better than others. He accepts anyone who worships him and does what is right. Again, only 2 rules. And suddenly the whole dynamic has changed. There was a complete shift. It was no longer about where you came from or who you were or had you kept all the rules. God was now throwing the door open for everyone to have a relationship with him. And it would not be based on our performance, but rather on his unconditional love for us. And as the book of Acts continues, we see many people, even the new Jewish Christians, still judging and still trying to impose the rules of religion on others. But Peter addresses this by saying, number 1, God knows people's hearts. So who are we to judge? God knows people's hearts. And number 2, God makes no distinctions between us and them. He accepts anyone, no matter who they are or what they've done. He accepts anyone who believes in him. Jesus had come to earth and replaced the rules of religion with a better way. And as I mentioned earlier, we would take a quick look at Jesus, the original religious rule rebel. Chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3 of the book of Mark contain the most definitive stories on how Jesus came to earth to change the entire paradigm around the rules. There are many incredible stories of Jesus here, and I wish we were able to look at them all so you can see his heart and love for people and not for the rules. If you have a chance, read chapters 2 and 3 of Mark this week, if you're able to. Throughout these 2 chapters, you can just see, it's funny, you can just see Jesus pushing the religious leaders' buttons saying, just watch me break all of your religious rules. Because the rules are never more important than people's hearts and lives. The rules are not what matters most. Relationships are. Helping hurting, broken people is what matters most. So we see in Mark chapter 2, Jesus starts off by asking a tax collector. I know a lot of us aren't big fans of the tax department and doing our taxes, but it was even worse then. And Jesus asks the tax collector to leave his business and follow him. The tax collectors were hated by everyone because of how they ripped off people and manipulated laws for their own gain and to please the Romans they were working for. They were the lowest of the low. How could Jesus even talk to him and then invite him to be his follower and friend, and finally invite him to his house where he eats with other tax collectors and those the religious leaders considered the scum of society? Jesus shatters the rules, and the religious leaders are furious. Their heads are about to explode. How dare Jesus eat with these sinners, all these people with bad reputations? How dare he break religion's rules? It's because Jesus was bringing a revolution of love. The time had come and the wait was over. Thousands of years of having to follow every single rule had come to an end. Jesus came to replace the hundreds of rules of religion with a much better way. And Jesus tells us in Mark 1:15, the time has come. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news. And the good news is that God was showing the entire world that they were all invited into this brand new kingdom. And you no longer had to act or speak or be a certain way or be from a certain ethnicity or follow hundreds of laws. all it takes is a simple change of heart. And Jesus' pursuit of sinners, his pursuit of the imperfect and of the broken, showed that God's acceptance of you, his acceptance of me, his acceptance of who we really are, our identity, is not based on our performance and adherence to the rules, like every other religion demands, but rather on his unconditional love and forgiveness and grace. And everyone, no matter who you were, no matter what you had or had not done, was invited to experience his love and acceptance. Everyone was treated equally and valued and loved. It was truly a revolution that broke all of religion's rules. At the beginning of Mark chapter 3, it's the Sabbath day, and this was the holy day of the week for the Jews. And we see Jesus in the temple, and there's a man there with a withered, crippled hand, which had likely caused him much hurt and much pain. But Jesus had compassion on him. And he knew the religious leaders were watching him. He knew they were waiting for him to break the rules by helping and healing someone on the Sabbath. And we see that Jesus looks around and he's angry because to them the rules were more important than him loving and helping and healing this man. So he says to himself, just watch me break your rules. And he heals the man. And they are so furious, they have to leave to figure out a way to kill him. And that's because religion's rules will always find a way to try and kill the unconditional love and acceptance of God. One more really touching story in closing. In the book of John chapter 8, Jesus is in the temple teaching, and there's a huge crowd all around him, and they're leaning in and they're listening intently. But suddenly there's this commotion, and a group of men come bursting through the crowd, dragging a woman who is sobbing and embarrassed and humiliated. And these self-righteous, hypocritical religious leaders, having caught her in bed, having sex with a man that is not her husband, throw her in front of Jesus. And there she stands in all her shame. And she's desperately trying to keep herself covered with the sheet that she grabbed as they pulled her out of her bed and out of her house. And we have to ask the question, how did they know she was there in the bed with a man unless they set her up to fail? And religion does set us up to fail. It sets us up for humiliation and shame. And you can just imagine, you can see the self-righteous arrogance that is coming from them. And some may have already bent down and picked up stones in their hands. And with all of their religious pride and superiority, they say to Jesus that the law, the rules say she is to be stoned to death. What do you have to say about this, Jesus? And Jesus ignores them. And he calmly stoops down and begins to write in the dust with his finger. And so they're even angrier that he's ignoring them. So they keep hounding him and they're yelling about stoning her. And what is his decision? And all of a sudden he stands up and there's silence. What will he say? Surely he'll say she's guilty according to the religious rules and needs to be stoned to death. But instead, he looks them in the eye and he says to them, Whichever one of you has never sinned, whichever one of you has never had a sinful desire, you go ahead and throw the first stone. And the crowd is shocked and amazed. And he bends down and starts writing in the dust again. And you know, he's likely writing their names and writing their deepest, darkest, secret sins. And all of a sudden, the humiliation and the embarrassment that was on this poor woman now shifts to them, and one by one, they drop their stones and they slink away. And then it was just the woman left standing there with Jesus. And she looks up, and Jesus looks up with nothing but kindness in his eyes and says, "Where did they all go? Did no one judge you guilty?" And she quietly shakes her head and says, "No." And Jesus says, "I don't judge you either. Go, but don't sin any longer." Jesus breaks religion's rules by not judging and condemning her, but he calls her to a better life, a better way, a better kingdom. A kingdom where the rules are about what matters most: love and mercy and compassion. A kingdom based on relationship, not on rules. There are two very important questions we need to ask this morning. Number one, how many times have I been the one that stood there like those men in religious pride or arrogance, judging someone else who didn't follow all the rules? How many times have we rejected those who didn't look or speak or act or measure up to our misguided rules and standards? The second question is even worse. How many times have you yourself, like the woman, been judged harshly by religion's rules? How many times have you been rejected or humiliated or dared to ask questions and have been made to feel shame like the woman? And so in your pain, you walked away from Jesus' love and grace and compassion and his plan for your life. Jesus came to show us that it was not about the rules, but it was about our hearts. It was about relationship. And throughout this current pandemic, they've been urging people to get home, to come back to safety and security. And this morning for you, it's time to come home. Jesus is saying, on the outside, you may not measure up, I may not measure up to the rules of religion. We may not act or speak right or look right or smell right or behave right, but you are exactly who he wants to be with, exactly who he wants to hang out with, exactly who he came to this world for, exactly who he died a brutal death for, and exactly who he was resurrected for, exactly who he broke religion's rules for. I'm going to close in prayer this morning, and wherever you are, if you're able to, I want you to pray along with me and repeat after me. No one even has to hear you. You can just quietly be moving your lips. Jesus, thank you for breaking religion's rules. Thank you that there is nothing I can do to make you love me more, and there is nothing I can do to make you love me less. I acknowledge that I've really messed up at times. I acknowledge that I am far from perfect, and that even though I have sinned, you still love me. Thank you for dying on the cross and rising from the dead for me. Jesus, please come into my life. Please come into my world. I really need your help. I want to come home. If you prayed that prayer for the first time this morning, we'd love for you to text LIFE to 587-323-1199 so we can connect with you. Even if you have questions, even if you just want to have a discussion, we'd love for you to text us. So thank you for joining us this morning all across this country and other countries and all across the world. We just pray that God blesses you and keeps you and your family safe this week. May God also grant you peace during this time of trouble. And please remember to be an encouragement and help to those who so desperately need us. And please call us or contact us in any way if we can be of any help to you. God bless you, and thank you for joining us.